everyone in the department is welcome to participate. We encourage you to do so. The committee meets once a month, and we rotate between an event and speaker like this. And you may remember that we had Tiffany Vino present her research back in December, and some kind of journal club or other discussion, and then a working and administrative meeting. And when we have this meeting, we when it's the month for this meeting, we put it into the research conference time slot to make it more convenient for people. The other meetings take place on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Once a month. And if you're interested in joining the committee, you can ask, you can send an email to myself or Paul Gorman or Lynn Schwabe, and we'll get you connected into the committee. So it gives me great honor to introduce our speaker today, who many of you know, Dr. George Mejicano, who's the Senior Associate Dean for Education in the School of Medicine. So he oversees all of the educational mission of the school, including our graduate program. And we've asked him to come today because he has been involved in, at the School of Medicine level, developing the School of Medicine strategic plan for diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, which he's going to talk about. He's also going to make some comments about the Covington report. And the goal of this session is to for us to hear what's happening at the school level, how we can integrate it at the department level, and I presume he'll leave time for questions and discussion. People can ask questions and so forth. Just to give a brief introduction, Dr. Mejicano and I have followed a somewhat similar path growing up in Chicago, and training in medicine at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, actually doing undergraduate in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Although during my training, I interacted more with his older brother, who I did my residency at University of Illinois Hospital with. George trained in internal medicine and infectious diseases. He's been involved in a lot of efforts with education, particularly at the undergraduate medical education level. He was the PI, or is the PI of our grants from the American Medical Association to accelerate change in education. He also has a master's degree in adult education, and spent a number of years at the University of Wisconsin before he came to OHSU. And so I will turn the floor over to him and ask him to take it away. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Bill and Paul, for asking me to come and speak. I'm going to actually go through three very brief PowerPoints, and really hope to at least have half an hour of discussion. And as Bill framed it, I had a major role with regards to the new School of Medicine Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism Strategic Action Plan, and then Paul did ask me also to talk about the Covington report. So with that, let me launch into this, and I can send the slides to all of you, so no worries about that at all. Okay, so my partner in crime here, so to speak, is Leslie Garcia, but there's been a lot of other people involved as well. Mo Daya, Mina Win, and many others. So the school embarked on creation of a new action plan, and as you can see here in the circle, that this is basically a roadmap, if you will, for the next 5 years. And through a inclusive process that the committee took, the Diversity Affairs Committee of the school took on, we embraced these tag words of belong, include, and empower. So let me first talk about how the plan is organized. The plan, the idea is it's a single plan for the entire School of Medicine, but we must align with university-wide efforts. And Dr. Jacobs has said that the university must become an anti-racist, multicultural organization. And so underneath that overarching plan, the structure is that we have 3 goals, also known as timeless aspirations. And the analogy I'm using here is one of direction. So in other words, what's our true north? So the 3 goals basically tell us which direction we need to go. And each of those 3 goals underneath them has actually 3 objectives. So a total of 9 objectives. And you can think of that using that same analogy as the distance we're going to travel in those directions. And then underneath each of those are tactics. So there's a total of 79 tactics. And you can think of that as the method by which we will travel that distance in that direction. So again, just the overall structure, 1 big plan, 3 goals, 9 objectives, 79 tactics. And there is an expectation that each department, center, and institute will create a unit level plan that will essentially align with the School of Medicine's overarching plan. Because if you look at each of the tactics, you'll see that some will be frankly more germane to some departments versus others. And DMICE, as Bill has pointed out to me many times, is a very unique department, sort of in the twilight between clinical and basic science. And so I can imagine that some of these will be extremely relevant to you, and some will be very little relevance to you. So, and again, this is sort of an overarching structure piece. So there's our 3 taglines: belong, include, empower, and underneath them, the 3 objectives. So, and we're going to go through each of these in turn. So here are our 3 directions, or our 3 timeless aspirations. So under the tagline of belong, the idea here is that the school is going to create and foster a learning and working environment. And I want to emphasize both the learning environment and the working environment. And that we welcome, celebrate, and support all learners, staff, faculty, leaders, and community members, especially persons from marginalized groups who historically are underrepresented in medicine and the biomedical sciences. So the idea here is really one of making sure that we create a space and a place where people want to come. They want to belong here. They feel that they belong here. And notice that it's not just about faculty and staff. It includes all the learners, but it also reaches out into the community. The second goal, with the tagline of include, is really about what I would call academic and professional and career advancement. And so the school will recruit, admit, hire, mentor, support, retain, graduate, advance, and promote individuals who are representative of the increasingly diverse population of Oregon and the nation. So the idea here is not only do we want people to feel welcome here, we want people to succeed here, to thrive here. And so that's why there's all those words. It's not just enough to recruit, for example, diverse graduate students or diverse faculty or staff members. We want to make sure that they have a pathway that they will get promoted, they will advance in whatever career or component they're involved with in the university. And then finally, the third one is really about shared power or shared governance. And the idea here is that the School of Medicine will commit to achieving a more just and equitable world by embracing a social mission that leverages its resources and expertise to aid underserved populations and reduce health disparities. And so these 3, these timeless aspirations, in many ways are unreachable, or they're definitely on the stretch dimension. These are going to be hard, and the committee purposely wanted to sort of push the school to try to do better, and so that's why it has the language that it does. And in particular, the third one, by explicitly calling out the social mission that we are here for. It's not just the academics, right, or the education and research missions, or the clinical mission, but we actually have a social mission. And I think a good example of how the university's work is manifesting that is with the vaccine equity work to try to get vaccines, especially in populations who are under-resourced and marginalized. So those are the three directions, or again, timeless aspirations. So let's go through into a little bit more detail for each one of these. So that first one, the first goal of belonging, I'm not going to read through each one of these bullets, but you can see the organization here. So the three objectives beneath that, or that support that timeless aspiration. The first one focuses on education and training, and then there's one of engagement, and then there's one of enrichment. I'm going to just pull out a few of the phrases here. And the idea here is that we need to do a lot more professional development. So that includes things like unconscious bias training, bystander training, things like that, but also, frankly, things relative to theory and practice around diversity. That's everything from best practices for hiring managers to, frankly, whether or not we should eliminate standardized testing for all of our admissions process. The graduate study, as most of you know, graduate programs essentially have said the GRE should not be used. The question is whether on the MD program, for example, should we actually eliminate the MCAT? That's an example of realizing the issues of bias around standardized testing and then doing something about it. But the idea here is we need to learn more about this. We are, I would say, we're moving from unconsciously incompetent to consciously incompetent in terms of our knowledge base around DEI and A issues. The second one is really about engagement. And again, we want to make sure that everyone feels that they belong, right? That's the tagline here is belong. And that means that we need to make sure that we support all the members and look at it through an equity lens and amplify their voices. And so that means everything from like representation on committees is just one example of that. And then finally, we need to also think about sort of celebrating it. So I applaud you that you and focusing attention on this. So I applaud you that you're using a research conference on a quarterly basis as an example to enrich the conversation through a DEI lens. So under the second goal of inclusion, this really is about both driving numbers, but also making sure that people thrive. You'll notice that there are 20 separate tactics related to recruitment. And we want to absolutely diversify all the different groups at OHSU. But you'll see the second one is really about making sure that we retain them. How leaky is our pipeline, so to speak? Or said differently, if we recruit, say, for example, an African American faculty member, do they actually stay? And is their retention rates the same as somebody else, someone from a different category? And you got to do this with fuel, meaning resources, right? And so we need to make sure that these efforts are appropriately funded to move this work along. And that's a tall order because what we've done at OHSU arguably is we've talked a pretty good talk, but we've not put the resources in to really move things forward. And that's everything from scholarships to support of our interest groups, employee resource groups, things like that. And then finally, the third goal of empowerment, it's broken up into really helping enable groups. And this is the idea here is that really about system issues, right? How do we actually look at the structural issues to make sure that things are in place that we eliminate barriers in a systematic manner, and that we look at our structures and systems. And so I'll just give you one that's related to women, but it's a good example, which is time to degree or time to promotion different if you have if there's expectations, for example, around other kinds of familial or social responsibility based upon on one's culture, and so should there be different clocks, for example, for time to degree? That's an example of looking at our structures and systems. The second one here is really about making sure that we are engaging with the community, and that is really, we frankly need the help of the community. Right? There's this in quality improvement in the clinical setting. There's this phrase that says, "Nothing about the patient without the patient." Well, I would argue that we cannot be in an ivory tower here. We have to be community engaged, and that's everything. It includes the research mission, for example, participatory research, and for example, in rural areas. And then finally, we need to make sure that we evaluate our effort. This should be a CQI process, and have this be data driven. The tactics that we're making progress on, that's great. Celebrate those. The ones we're not making progress, why is that? And to try to be nimble in this 5-year. It's more than a 5-year journey, but this plan for 5 years. So this just to give you some timelines here. The Diversity Affairs Committee endorsed the plan in September. The Faculty Council adopted it in November, and it was approved by Dr. Jacoby as the interim dean that same date. And so we are in the process of doing the bottom part of this slide. We're going to create a diversity alignment team to coordinate and implement the plan, both with CDI and other efforts across the university, including the Covington stuff, but also the departmental plans. We need to add, frankly, specifics to each of the tactics. So things like the metrics, how will we know we've achieved things? We're socializing and disseminating, and that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to do just that. We'll be creating a dashboard to track and show our progress. And again, each department is expected to create their own unit level plan. Here's again a bunch of resources, and hopefully all of you saw recently Leslie sent out a new diversity newsletter, and so that's an example of the kinds of things that we'll be doing going forward. So lots and lots of current efforts, but we need to also move forward. So that's the relatively quick overview of the diversity action plan. I'm going to switch now to a very brief PowerPoint about the Covington report, and then again, I'd rather have a dialogue than be just talking to all of you. So with that, let me switch now to this other presentation here. And Paul, you shared this, but I'm not sure with who. Is that correct? Paul?
I did not share it yet. I was waiting for you to present it.
Okay, perfect. Great. Okay, so I created this for the Diversity Affairs Committee because we needed to have a forum to talk about the Covington report. So this is a high-level view of the Covington report, and I have to do a content warning for all of you because this small deck contains topics that could be activating for survivors of racial or gender or ethnic violence. So please take care of yourself. If you have to walk away or turn off the video feed, that's perfectly okay. Be safe. That's very important. So as all of you hopefully know, the Covington investigation was prompted by concerns related to both gender and racial discrimination. And there were multiple incidents. The Jason Campbell stuff was I would say the biggest one. But there were other ones as well, like, for example, the findings of nooses on campus are examples. And so because of that, the board of directors decided to undertake a broad review of the university's institutional culture. And I want to make sure people understand that. This was not a decision by Dr. Jacobs. This was not a decision by CDI. This was a decision by the board of directors of the entire university. And they were looking at it not just for what happened in one incident, but they were looking at cultural issues. And that's really important to understand because although some of the recommendations provide, I would say, a pretty clear path forward about what needs to be done, the underlying piece really is about culture. And that's really where I think the heavy lifting needs to occur. So, to do this, the university retained a law firm that has some very well-known luminaries, including the former Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. And in italics, you can see that the investigation was going to look at inequitable treatment, discrimination, harassment, bullying, or intimidation based on race, color, religion, national origin, disability, age, marital status, sex, including pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, or gender expression. And they were going to look at policies, procedures, and practices, and to see if they were frankly designed to ensure that people were being treated equitably and that conduct was being prevented, and really look at us compared to best practices across the country. And so the report was publicly released, and I think that's an important step. It wasn't hidden. Just a quick aside: Seattle Children's, you may have heard, had a very similar investigation by Covington, and their board of directors actually tried to bury it. They tried to actually not. They actually only gave like an overview, and it led to some heads rolling because of that. So at OHSU, the board of directors said, no, this should be released publicly so everyone sees what Holder and company had to say. And the report starts and frames things by looking at our culture challenges. And these are frankly pretty depressing comments, but I believe them to be true. Each one of these resonate with me. I was not surprised by any of this, but it's important to say them out loud. So we as a university have failed to create an environment which community members feel values diversity, equity, inclusion, and makes them feel welcome and safe. In other words, there are people walking around, working at the university, some for decades, and it's not a safe place. It's not a welcoming place. And frankly, we do not collectively value, we act in a way that does not value this. And the second one is that community members, meaning OHSU members, report differing experiences based on protected characteristics, status, or position. In other words, staff are treated, for example, differently than faculty. Men are treated differently than women. People who are white are treated differently than people who are Hispanic, and so forth and so on. In other words, there are different rules for different people. And I think most people, if you think about this honestly, that will resonate with you. It is certainly, I've been here for almost 10 years. That has certainly been my experience at OHSU. The third one is that there's a perception of significant risk and very little benefit of reporting misconduct, primarily because you put your head out, your neck out, if you will, and yet nothing seems to change. And so there we have a very big problem. This is the exact opposite of a culture of safety where people feel that they're empowered to point out problems, to improve. The fourth cultural piece is that the community members believe that OHSU does not hold people equally accountable. That's related to number two, but now we're talking about high stakes accountability. Do people lose their jobs or get reprimanded, et cetera? And some of you may have seen that. In fact, we do reprimand and we do dismiss more people of color proportionally than people who are in majorities, white males in particular. And then the fifth one is that the community perceives that OHSU tends to view reports of misconduct with skepticism and doubt. In other words, you raise concerns and you're the one that gets questioned, not the person who was alleged to do something. So these are big cultural issues. These are heavy lifts. So those were the underlying cultural issues. What did they actually find? And I like the part in parentheses at the top. These flow from, contribute to, or exacerbate the cultural challenges. The findings include that our actions and communications with respect to DEI misconduct and human resources are not aligned with our stated values. The second one is that we have not established clear priorities, an institution-wide strategy to drive change, or policies that effectively address DEI. In other words, some people think that, oh, that's CDI does that work. We don't do that work. And we don't even know what that work is, writ large. We're basically, it's not even, I would even say it's not even coordination, cooperation. I think we're antagonistic sometimes with regards to this. The third is that the policies and procedures addressing misconduct are inconsistent and lack clarity and precision. And just to give you an example, there are multiple reporting mechanisms. So who do you call? Do you call AAEO or Title IX or the Confidential Advocacy Program or HR? And that's certainly a big problem. Number 4 is that there's the university lacks a consistent process for addressing and documenting concerns, and that we don't close the loop, and so employees are dissatisfied, and the outcomes are not always fully informed or effectively implemented. And in fact, hiring managers and chairs and division heads and center directors could actually ignore, for example, the recommendations from AAE or HR. We have not put our money where our mouth is at, and that's what the 5th one's about. We've devalued and marginalized human resources. We have not provided the resources, the leadership, and the authority to them. And for an institution with essentially 19,000 employees, that's a very big problem. So from these cultural flashpoints and these findings, here are the recommendations. And they're broken up into 3 themes: tone from the top, resources and staffing, and policies and procedures. So tone from the top, to affirm a resolute commitment to DEI and A. In other words, you have to say from the very top, we are committed to do this work, and you have to mean it. And therefore, you have to elevate that throughout the entire institution. And so it has to reflect in our policies, our practices, and our cultures, and our governance processes. And we need to strengthen accountability so that people really understand the consequences of this and how important they are with regards to expectations. So that's basically saying that the leadership has to buy in. And then there's a bunch of resource pieces. These are what I would call more the transactional stuff. We have to, frankly, do a nationwide search for a leader for human resources. We also have to centralize functions. I'll just give you a concrete example that some of you know. For many years, the head of human resources for the School of Medicine reported to the dean. Not anymore, right? So the human resources apparatus, if you will, goes directly to human resources and does not report to David Jacoby now. And Cyrilda has already started this by assigning basically 2 HR senior business managers, Kendra Seitz and Fiona Canova, to that role, to being the liaisons, but they don't report to David Jacoby. The 3rd one is basically provide more investigators and people who are trained and who do it consistently, and restructure, increase, and diversify the staffing in those units. And then in terms of policies and procedures, be very clear about what is expected and what's prohibited, and how the university will address such misconduct. Streamline and revise the reporting structures and the investigational procedures. Streamline the channels listed in policies and guidance documents about reporting. Strengthen mandatory reporting provisions so that everyone knows if you're in this kind of job, you have to report these kinds of actions and activities. And then finally, make sure that there's non-retaliation provisions in those P&Ps. So where is this? The university has committed to Dr. Jacobs, and the board expects this, but Dr. Jacobs has committed that there will be transparent communications about these findings and recommendations. The university cabinet did in fact discuss this, and they've set into motion the action steps that are going forward. And so there's going to be there's an implementation committee that already has started to meet. That's chaired by Alice Kupel-Comas and Susan Bakewell-Sachs. And there's going to be an oversight committee, and that's going to be co-chaired by 2 essentially outsiders. I'm blanking out on the person. One of the persons used to be the head of the Urban League of Portland. I forgot his name. And then the other person is Alicia Moreland Kapua, who used to be a faculty member, but now she's at Harvard. And the Diversity Affairs Committee of the school we've already been discussing this. We're looking at how the action plan needs to change, and we want to better coordinate with CDI. And with that, I think I'm right on time here. I'm going to stop sharing and really just have a conversation with all of you around these two initiatives. This is really important work, and I hope all of you take this seriously, and that you all, each of us, does a reflects on what we can do better individually as well as collectively. So with that, Bill, I will open it up to see if there's comments, questions.
Yeah, thanks, George. That's a tremendous effort that many people have put forth in this, and that we as an institution have needed to do. Let me just ask, as we always do, people can either unmute themselves to ask questions or type them into the chat. Well, I guess maybe I'll ask one question. Certainly, by the committee that we have in our department, there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm in doing this. One of the concerns that has been brought up is how integrated this is with other efforts. Should we, as a department, be reinventing things? Are there ways we can collaborate with other departments, with the dean's office, others around the institution, to develop plans so we're not necessarily starting from scratch?
It's a really important piece because, as you know, Bill, a lot of the departments have functioned in a either autonomous or semi-autonomous manner, and we certainly would not want to put a damper on sort of innovation, creativity, and what I would say, ground actions that are occurring from the ground up. And so if DMICE, for example, said, well, we're really interested in with your expertise in epidemiology, right? So we want to do something based upon that in terms of, I don't know, raising our research portfolio, for example. We would want you to have the freedom to do that. But what we would hope is that it aligns with the school's action plan, which broadly says that more research on diversity should occur, right, as one of the tactics. So as long as the alignment is there, we don't want to micromanage in any way. So that's, I think, really important. And so the next steps, and by the way, I don't think we're going to change the action plan very much based on Covington. I think it will just reinforce a few things. But I expect that sometime in the March to June period, we expect each department to start rolling up their sleeves and creating their own a DMICE specific action plan, like I mentioned at the beginning. So think of it like Venn diagrams. What we don't want is, we don't want a circle that's completely outside, never intersecting with anything. We want it to intersect with the school's plan. That's with regards to DEI and A activities, broadly speaking. The Covington stuff is going to be, I think, much more centrally managed. And that's going to be driven by the implementation committee that Susan and Alice co-chair. So I do think that that's going to be driven, like things like human resource restructuring, staffing of AAEO, policies and procedures around who's a mandatory reporting. Those are going to be central processes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, that does. And I will turn over the floor to Chris Alpe, the OHSU librarian, who is also a DMICE faculty member. Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. So the question I really have is about how you see the School of Medicine's plan fitting into the rest of the university plans at the school kind of levels. If you think about all the different learners who are in interaction with everybody in the School of Medicine that's going to be engaged towards working towards this plan and goals, how does this look for interprofessional engagement? How is the School of Medicine's plan interfacing with the School of Nursing or with the Provost's office, given that we have a new provost coming? Do you have a sense for how this situates for learners with those other entities? There's kind of this leadership gap between, not gap, but level between the president and the board and the School of Medicine that our learners experience from many of the issues on here. And I just wondered if you could speak to that. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, it's a good question, and it's a complicated area. I'll try to get at it, but I think this is an trying to find the right way of saying this. Part of the problem has with patience and the balance between being reflective and thoughtful and action oriented. And so we talked a lot about this in the Diversity Affairs Committee, and Mo Daya, who was the prior chair before Mina, Mo and myself and Leslie had many conversations around this issue. You'll see where I'm going in about a minute. And the School of Medicine, some of you may be acutely aware of this, is sometimes accused of basically acting unilaterally. And essentially not being patient with the university to move things forward. And there's a desire in some cases because we feel an urgency to move things forward. And Chris, as the librarian, as our chief of the library, I think you've seen that and felt that. I would be surprised if you haven't felt that. So there's that tension of how do you sort of get in sync with university efforts, and especially have the provost's office or the health system, and yet also be accountable and responsible to move things forward. And so the big piece there, I think, is about communication and making sure that people are engaged and that you're clear about everything going forward. And I'll give you a very concrete example about the action plan. So I personally kept Dr. Jacobs abreast of the school's proposed diversity action plan, the governance process by which it was going to be approved or not approved. And I actually asked him, like, should we stop? Should we delay? And wait. And the response was, no, you should proceed. Just make sure you're coordinated. And so it's all of us working together. And so Derek Duvivier was, I kept him abreast of where things were going. Human resources, the same thing. And so I think there's a long way of saying, don't wait, but just make sure you're checking in with different stakeholders. Now, with regards to, I'll give you a concrete example with regards to educational pieces, right? And so as the people involved with the graduate programs know, we've been pushing really hard to try to diversify our graduate students at OHSU. There's no reason to delay those efforts, and whether it's with looking at our admissions processes, looking at mentoring, looking at where we recruit. Certainly that would be true, Bill, for faculty hiring practices, things along those lines. We know those are going to be in line with what the university is going to want to do. So we should proceed with best practices. And so it's a sort of a squishy way of trying to respond to don't wait, but coordinate. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, and it rhymes. I like that. Don't wait, just coordinate. Really catchy.
I'm going to do one other thing here, Bill, while we're waiting for other questions to see if there are questions. Sure. I'm going to put the link to the new School of Medicine Diversity, the updated School of Medicine Diversity site. And if you click on that link, there's a lot of information there, but right in the middle, you'll see the actual plan. So if people want to read the entire plan, they can click there for the link and they can get all the 79 tactics. And I see Jim's got his hand up. Hey, Jim.
Hi, George. Thanks. This is really impressive, and I note in particular that it emphasizes culture change. And although policies and procedures are always very important, when it comes to culture change, people at the front lines are asking, "What's in it for me?" But they're also looking to the behaviors and actions that their leaders take, and that places a special responsibility on leadership. Not that we all don't have special responsibility, but what should the leadership be doing? How they need to be seen, they need to be heard, and they need to be doing things that are consistent with our aspirations here. What are your thoughts on that? I think you're muted, George.
Sorry, it's a great question, and I know you and I have had conversations about organizational change management, and you know that I'm a believer in Kotter's theory. So, for those of you that don't know, there's John Kotter basically has a theory on how to drive organizational change management. I'll give you a couple of pieces just to give you an example, because this is really happening. So one of the issues around being a truly anti-racist, multicultural organization is to be acutely aware and have front of mind issues relative to trauma, to have a sort of use a trauma-informed systems perspective with regards to these kinds of things. And that, as an example, that's why I put the content warning slide at the beginning of the Covington conversation or slide set. Every member of the university cabinet actually went through a 2-day training, but I can vouch for it. It was 7 hours both days, and it was run actually out of Alicia Moreland Kapua's shop at McLean, which is one of the Harvard system hospitals, and it was eye-opening about how trauma is propagated, and I'll give you just one example. A lot of people say, like, well, just assume good intentions, right? Assume people are trying their best. Well, if you've been traumatized, that's not necessarily a safe assumption to make, right? And so how do we have these conversations, and how do we create policies that are truly trauma informed? So that's an example where the leadership was expected and did participate in external training to learn and be more informed about how to address these kinds of issues. Because we're not all at the same place. We're not the field has not been level set. So that's an example. And so I do think it's almost like the opposite of Six Sigma, where there's like lots of green belts and a few black belts. In this case, it's like the leadership has to be maybe not black belt, but maybe brown belt or orange belt. The leadership, I think, has an obligation to, frankly, learn more about this than other groups, and to be exemplars with regards to this. And so that might look like, having discussion forums around misogyny, right? Or words that can make the hair stand on end in certain parts of the country, but like critical race theory and things like that. So that's an example of increased expectations for leadership. I think the second, an additional part, personally, is frankly is to apologize. There's psychological healing, in my view, in my experience, in not just reflecting on one's own responsibility around things that have occurred, but also things that didn't occur. In Catholicism, we talk about sins of commission and sins of omission, and I think there's sort of that personal accountability piece, because right now, in my view, I don't know if you and the other faculty members and other people that are here would agree with this, but I think one of our biggest problems is that our trust is basically in the basement, maybe in the ground underneath the foundation of the basement, It's that low. And so you have to start with relationship building, and part of that is apologizing. And you know, what have we done individually and collectively to propagate things? And I'll give you, there's many examples, but there's everything from like gender, salary mismatch, as an example, otherwise known as pay equity. But there's also things around, you know, the promotion practices. There's things around general mistreatment of different groups on campus, and I certainly have played a role in that, and I'm profoundly sorry for that, and that it needs to start with that kind of mentality. I think almost a humility of it. You know, in 12-step programs, the first thing you have to say is that, you know, I have a personal responsibility to this. Right? So I think that's the second part, and then the third part. And I'll try to make this quick, but it's a really complicated area. The third part is that we can't settle for transactional change. We have to embrace transformational change. That's hard work. And it's going to be, frankly, tortuous. Not to be too dramatic here, but I encourage all of you to read Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he says, I mean, the famous words are there with, you know, with malice towards none and charity for all, et cetera, et cetera. But the part before that was, you know, if the blood from the bondsmen, you know, whipping slaves, has to be repaid by the blood of bullets and swords, so be it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. I think there's something to that.
Thanks, George. I think you were really right about trust, and that's hard work, but it needs to be done.
Yeah, Joanne, I think you have your hand raised.
Yes. Hi. I teach a course in ethics. And one of the things that comes up occasionally, I should say more often than not, when we talk about research, ethics, and diversity, students have been more than honest about their concerns related to how they've been treated, either universally or specifically at the university. And it's usually a free flow discussion. I give my comments as well. But I have been more concerned about, you know, when we talk about trust, this is what kind of generated this concept in my mind, the trust issue around when a student does talk about these things, how much further as individual instructor should I take the comments that they've made, which are within the context of the course, but perhaps indicate that they have been hurt in some way by the institution or whatever. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect on that. How much responsibility do we take? We're not, you know, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know to what level you raise the issue and what my responsibility is to the individual student. Sometimes I have emailed them individually and said I picked up on something and I'm concerned about it. What, you know, what can I do for you, or something like that. But it's been tickling me more and more as I'm teaching the course to a more diverse student population. And I'm wondering if you could please reflect on what your recommendations would be.
I appreciate the comment and the question. I'll give you my personal perspective on this, but I think this is going to be, we need to have further dialogue, but I'll tell you where I am with this. So I consider myself a mandatory reporter. And so whenever there's a learner involved, whether it's a student or a resident, a fellow, postdoc, et cetera, whenever there's a learner that's involved, and if there's an issue of mistreatment or abuse or harassment, et cetera, I I automatically elevate it. I have submitted dozens and dozens and dozens of reports to integrity. And in my first 9 years here at OHSU, I thought I had a pretty good sense of like, oh, this goes to HR, this goes to Title IX, this goes to AAEO, et cetera. But that's going to be streamlined. So my sense is it will probably be more of a one-stop shop for reporting. We'll see what the Covington Implementation Committee comes up with. But my point here is that I have a very low threshold. It's such a non-existent threshold. I escalate this all the time, and I think there's a real fear, or maybe that's the wrong word, a concern, maybe twin concerns. One is it's none of my business, or I only know one piece of this, and then the second one is I'm not sure that the person who has shared this information would want me to do this. And I will tell you, based on my experience and looking at a lot of data on mistreatment of both residents and students, is that we have a toxic culture. And so I escalate. I always escalate this. And I liken this, maybe this is inappropriate. All of you will judge it, have opinions about what I'm about to say, but I liken this to hearing about elder abuse or child abuse in the clinical setting. All right. To me, we have an obligation to bring these things to light. And since this is DMICE, and there's a bunch of epidemiologists on the faculty, I look at this as surveillance, right? This is public health surveillance. And that doesn't mean that every accusation or allegation is true. There needs to be due process and substantiation and all that kind of stuff. But we should not be shy in raising the concerns. I do have, having said that, I do, as an educator, have some uneasiness around guilt by popularity, or maybe let me say differently, guilt by being tried in the court of public opinion as opposed to a good investigation. But I think if our systems are in place with solid investigatory skills and personnel, then my concern is that will really fall to the wayside. But at this point, my 2 cents to you, just my opinion, is I would report all of it. We're going to get more clarity about this, about mandatory reporting as new policies get rolled out.
I think that's really very helpful. And in my mind, I'm thinking that probably even within my course syllabus, I know we have some language right now about diversity, but I think there maybe within my syllabus, I need to have some sort of a disclaimer that although the forums are meant for classroom discussion, that I will report any concerns that I feel have come up. So that's the part where the trust comes in, with the student is feeling this is a closed group, and yet you're obviously I'm concerned about it. I'm nervous about it because there's been a couple of times that I'm like, ooh, this is concerning, and that's the reason why I've contacted the student, individually. But I appreciate your comments because I kind of believe in the low threshold myself. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Sorry, I very much appreciate the conversation. Actually, having taken your class, I just wanted to potentially contribute to this specific topic in terms of the concern that for anyone who is sharing in the class, and that I don't know that there is specifically the specific mandatory need to report everything except whereas permission has been given to report, like as you had previously been doing in terms of contacting students. And obviously that could change, like if you add that caveat to that. But from like a lot of the issue with the trust, I believe, is not trusting the higher levels. Like they may trust you with that information, but they may not trust the people you would report to.
I think that's a really important perspective to bring about. I guess as a and by the way, I've heard that the comment about not trusting the higher levels. I've heard that many times, and frankly, I also have concerns about that, to be blunt. But I guess I would say the following: as long as the expectations, or as long as the it's clear that these conversations should not be considered confidential, then I think that would be a path forward. If there is an expectation, implied or inferred, that oh, this is a safe space and that this is between quote a group of students and a faculty member, then I could see maybe thinking about this differently. But I will say, the only confidential discussions are with the confidential advocacy program. Other than that, you should not. I think of it this way, and maybe this is not a good way of thinking about it, but I'm just saying, I think about a classroom conversation as occurring in an elevator. It is not private.
Great. We're just about out of time. There's actually one more question in the chat from one of our postdocs, who I don't know if you can see it there, but thanks for your talk and sharing your wisdom, George. What would you say is the function of toxicity in medical institutions such as OHSU?
I'm not sure what is meant by the function of toxicity. I certainly think that the climate is toxic. And I'll point to two pieces, if you will. So one of them is the National Academies. I think it's been now 3 years, medicine, science, and engineering, provided a report about mistreatment, primarily gender focused, and the data was rampant. It's unbelievably high in the sciences. So we have a toxic culture that propagates mistreatment. So that would be part one of that. The second piece is, and this is my opinion, so you can all just blame me. I'll take full responsibility for this. I think that we are blinded to excellence or perceived excellence. And so we will tolerate a lot of bad behavior for luminaries, prestigious individuals, the big grants, the big publications, the big discoveries. And I'll close with this because I'll never forget this. About 3 or 4 years ago, Anita Hill, as in famous for the Clarence Thomas hearings for the Supreme Court, Anita Hill was the keynote speaker at a meeting of the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC. This is a room full of deans and high-level administrators, hundreds of people that were at this national meeting when we could gather in person. And Anita Hill basically said, how many of you have actually dismissed a Nobel laureate because of sexual harassment? And you could hear a pin drop. And she said, your silence is telling. And so the culture of excellence, frankly, is code for we value that more than we care about our people.
Great. Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I want to thank George. Actually, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the Lander, the scientist who resigned yesterday. So maybe that type of behavior won't be tolerated again more. But I want to thank George for coming and sharing this with us and hopefully giving some additional energy to our committee. And again, everyone in the department is welcome to take part. And maybe as we make more progress and move further along, we'll have the opportunity to chat with George again about this, and especially as things evolve at the school level.
Appreciate it. I know time is up here, Bill, but I guess I should say one final thing. This will be short. This is most of what I've said is really reporting stuff that was written about or my own personal opinion. I think what's important is for everyone to lean in. We need to hear all the voices. I certainly do not believe that I am right. I'm certainly unconsciously incompetent. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, George.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And Anne, we'll try to capture your question.